When Thomas Grayson discovered words pressed impossibly into his cabin wall from the barn side, spelling out a warning about the man claiming to own his rescued horses, his blood turned to ice. The massive white mare had somehow created a message during the night, and if she was right about the danger, he had just hours before a killer came to take her away. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the barren fields of Montana, carrying with it the scent of rain and something far more ominous. Thomas Grayson stood on the rotting porch of his cabin, his weathered hands gripping the splintered railing as he watched the sky turn an unnatural shade of green. At 67 years old, he had seen his share of storms, but there was something different about this one, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end and filled his chest with a dread he could not name. The farm, if it could still be called that, was little more than a collection of broken dreams scattered across 20 acres of stubborn earth. The barn leaned to one side like a drunk trying to find his way home, its red paint long since stripped away by decades of harsh winters and unforgiving summers. The fence posts stood at odd angles, connected by wire that sagged between them like the hopes Thomas had once carried in his younger days. His wife Sarah had passed 3 years ago, taking with her the last remnants of laughter that had once filled these empty spaces. And since then, Thomas had existed more than lived, going through the motions of each day without purpose or joy. He had no livestock left to speak of. The cattle had been sold off one by one when the debts became too heavy to carry, and the chickens had long since stopped laying eggs worth gathering. Even his old dog Rex had disappeared 2 months ago, probably wandering off to die in peace somewhere in the hills, leaving Thomas alone with only the wind and his memories for company. The townspeople rarely came out this far anymore, and when they did, they looked at him with a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if poverty were a disease they might catch if they stayed too long. The storm clouds rolled closer, blotting out what remained of the afternoon sun and casting long shadows across the fields. Thomas pulled his worn jacket tighter around his thin frame and considered going inside, but something held him there on the porch. Some instinct he could not explain. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the last hour, and the wind carried with it small pellets of ice that stung his face like angry wasps. This was going to be bad, possibly the worst storm of the season, and his cabin with its leaking roof and drafty walls would offer little protection. That was when he saw them. At first, they were just dark shapes moving through the swirling dust and debris at the far end of his property, emerging from the tree line like ghosts materializing from another world. Thomas squinted against the wind, his old eyes struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. As they drew closer, his breath caught in his throat and he felt his heart begin to pound with a force he had not experienced in years. It was a horse, but not just any horse. She was massive, easily 17 hands high, with a coat so white it seemed to glow even in the gathering darkness of the storm. Her mane whipped wildly in the wind, a cascade of silver that flowed like water down her powerful neck. But she was not alone. Flanking her on either side, pressed close to her body for protection, were 2 foals. They too were white, though their coats were duller, almost gray in the strange light, and they stumbled and struggled to keep pace with their mother as she drove them forward with determined urgency. The mare's eyes were wide with fear, her nostrils flared, and foam flecked her chest from the exertion of pushing through the strengthening winds. She was heading straight for Thomas's barn, as if she knew exactly where she was going, as if something had called her there. Thomas stood frozen, unable to move or speak, watching as this impossible vision approached his property. Wild horses had not been seen in this part of Montana for decades, driven out by development and hunting, and certainly not horses like these. There was something otherworldly about them, something that defied explanation. The mare's size alone was remarkable, but it was more than that. It was the way she moved with purpose and intelligence, the way she protected her foals with fierce maternal devotion, the way she seemed to look directly at Thomas with eyes that held an almost human quality of desperation and hope. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, splattering against the dry earth and raising small clouds of dust. Within seconds, the drops became a deluge, a wall of water that descended from the sky with punishing force. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it rattled the windows of the cabin and made Thomas stagger backward. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the strange procession of horses as they reached the edge of his property. The mare whinnied, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm, and her foals answered with high-pitched cries of fear. Thomas finally broke from his paralysis and lurched down the porch steps, his boots splashing in puddles that had already formed in the uneven ground. The rain soaked through his jacket in seconds, plastering his thin gray hair to his skull and running in rivulets down his weathered face. He waved his arms at the horses, not in threat, but in guidance, pointing toward the barn. The mare seemed to understand, or perhaps she had always intended to go there, and she drove her foals forward with renewed urgency. They crossed the final stretch of Thomas's land at a gallop, their hooves throwing up mud and water, three white shapes in a world that had turned gray and furious. Thomas reached the barn just as the mare and her foals arrived, all of them soaked to the bone and trembling from the cold and fear. He threw open the massive door, fighting against the wind that tried to rip it from his hands, and gestured frantically for the horses to enter. The mare needed no encouragement. She herded her foals inside with sharp nudges and urgent whinnies, and once they were through the threshold, she followed, her massive body filling the doorway completely for a moment before she cleared it. Thomas heaved the door closed behind them, throwing the rusted bolt into place with shaking hands, and suddenly the roar of the storm became muted, reduced to a distant howling that seemed to come from another world entirely. Inside the barn, the darkness was almost complete, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that leaked through the gaps in the walls and cast everything in stark shadows. Thomas fumbled for the old kerosene lantern he kept hanging by the door, his fingers clumsy with cold and age and the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. After 3 attempts, he managed to strike a match and light the wick, and warm yellow light spilled across the interior of the barn, revealing a space that he had not really looked at in years. The stalls were empty and filled with old hay that had turned gray with dust. Cobwebs draped from the rafters like tattered curtains, and the floor was littered with debris and forgotten tools. But none of that mattered now. What mattered were the 3 horses that stood in the center of the barn, steam rising from their wet coats in the lamplight. The mare was even more magnificent up close than she had been at a distance. She stood taller than any horse Thomas had ever seen, her head nearly brushing the beams of the barn ceiling. Her coat, even wet and bedraggled, shone with an almost pearlescent quality, and her eyes were the deepest brown, filled with intelligence and a wariness that made Thomas move slowly and carefully. The foals pressed against her sides, one on each flank, and they watched Thomas with the same cautious awareness as their mother. Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms out, showing that he meant no harm. He had grown up around horses in his youth before the farm had fallen on hard times, and he remembered the language of patience and respect that these noble creatures required. He spoke in a low, steady voice, words that meant nothing but carried the tone of comfort and safety. The mare's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movements, but she did not retreat or show aggression. She seemed to understand that this man, this weathered old farmer who smelled of loneliness and loss, was offering sanctuary from the storm that raged outside. Slowly, carefully, Thomas moved to one of the old stalls and began clearing out the ancient hay, tossing it aside with his bare hands. His back protested with sharp pains that shot down his legs, reminders of decades spent working this stubborn land, but he pushed through the discomfort. The mare and her foals needed a clean space to rest, somewhere dry where they could recover from their ordeal. As he worked, he spoke to them constantly, maintaining that low, steady stream of words that seemed to calm the horses and give them confidence in his intentions. He told them about the storm, about how fierce it sounded, but how they were safe here, about how he had once had a barn full of animals and now had none, about how strange and wonderful it was that they had appeared on this night of all nights. When the stall was reasonably clear, Thomas spread fresh hay that he found in a corner, bales that had somehow remained dry despite the leaking roof. It was not much, but it was better than the wet, muddy ground outside where the storm continued its assault. He stepped back and gestured toward the stall, and to his amazement, the mare understood. She moved forward slowly, her foals following like shadows, and entered the space he had prepared. Once inside, she immediately turned to her young ones, nuzzling them and checking them over with the careful attention of a devoted mother, making sure they had not been injured during their desperate flight from the storm. Thomas fetched water from the pump outside, making several trips despite the rain that drenched him anew each time. He carried the buckets back to the barn and poured the water into an old trough that he dragged into position near the stall. The mare drank deeply, her long throat working as she pulled in great gulps of the cool water, and the foals joined her, their smaller mouths creating ripples on the surface. He found some oats in a sealed container, grain that he had been saving for reasons he could no longer remember, perhaps some optimistic notion that he might one day have animals to feed again. He poured the oats into a feeding box and watched as the mare investigated the offering, sniffing it carefully before taking a cautious mouthful. The night deepened as the storm continued unabated. Thomas brought more blankets from his cabin, old quilts that Sarah had made years ago, and draped them over a beam near the horses to dry. He settled himself on a bale of hay in the corner of the barn, unwilling to leave his unexpected guests alone, afraid that if he went back to his cabin he might wake up and find this had all been a dream, born of loneliness and desperation. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the wind screamed like something alive and angry. But inside the barn there was a strange peace, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the presence of life where there had been only emptiness for so long. Thomas must have dozed off at some point during the night, because when he opened his eyes, the storm had quieted to a gentle rain, and the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. His body ached from sleeping sitting up on the hay bale, and for a moment he was disoriented, unsure of where he was or why he had spent the night in the barn. Then he heard the soft, snuffling sounds of the horses, and everything came rushing back. He turned his stiff neck to look at the stall and felt his breath catch once again at the sight of them. The mare was lying down with her foals curled against her, all three of them resting peacefully in the golden light of the new day. It had not been a dream after all. Thomas rose slowly, his joints cracking and popping in protest, and made his way quietly toward the stall. The mare's eyes opened at his approach, but she did not rise or show alarm. Instead, she watched him with that same intelligent gaze, assessing him once more in the clearer light of morning. He could see her more clearly now, and what he saw made him pause in wonder. She was not just large, she was perfectly proportioned, every muscle and bone in ideal alignment, her conformation suggesting breeding far beyond anything that should exist in a wild horse. Her hooves were enormous, each one the size of a dinner plate, with feathering around the fetlocks that marked her as draft horse stock. But her head was refined, almost Arabian in its delicate beauty, creating a combination that should not have been possible. The foals, too, were remarkable. Now that he could see them properly, Thomas realized they were not identical. One was slightly larger than the other, with a more masculine build already evident in his broader chest and thicker neck. The other was more delicate, clearly a filly, with longer legs and a more graceful bearing. Both had the same unusual coloring as their mother, that luminous white coat that seemed to hold hints of silver and pearl depending on how the light struck it. They bore no brands or markings that Thomas could see, nothing to indicate where they had come from or who they might belong to. He spent the morning tending to them, bringing more water and the last of his oats, which the mare accepted with growing trust. He cleaned the stall as best he could while they were in it, working around them with slow, careful movements that gradually seemed to reassure the protective mother. The foals, with the quick adaptability of youth, were already becoming curious about him, venturing a few steps away from their mother to sniff at his hands and clothes before scampering back to safety. Thomas found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember, charmed by their innocence and playfulness. By midday, the rain had stopped completely, and the sun emerged from behind the breaking clouds, turning the wet world into a landscape of diamonds and gold. Thomas opened the barn door to let in fresh air and light, and the mare rose to her feet with surprising grace for such a large animal, shaking herself and sending droplets of water flying in all directions. She walked to the doorway and looked out at the transformed world, her foals close beside her. And for a moment Thomas thought she might leave, might simply walk away and disappear back into whatever mysterious place she had come from. The thought filled him with an unexpected sadness, a sense of loss for something he had barely begun to experience. But she did not leave. Instead, she turned back to look at Thomas, and in her eyes he saw something that made his throat tighten with emotion. It was gratitude, pure and simple, and recognition of the debt she owed him for shelter and safety. She walked back into the barn and lowered her massive head toward him, and Thomas reached up with trembling hands to touch her face. Her coat was softer than anything he had ever felt, like silk or clouds, and she stood perfectly still for his touch, accepting it with the dignity of royalty, accepting homage from a loyal subject. That afternoon, Thomas went back to his cabin and rummaged through boxes he had not opened in years, looking for the old veterinary supplies he had kept from his farming days. He found what he needed, buried under layers of dust and memories: bottles of supplements, hoof picks, curry combs, and brushes. He carried everything back to the barn and spent the next several hours grooming the mare and her foals, working out the tangles in their manes and tails, checking their hooves for stones or damage, running his experienced hands over their bodies to feel for injuries or problems. He found nothing wrong with any of them. They were in remarkably good condition considering their ordeal, almost as if they had been well cared for until recently and then suddenly released or abandoned. As he worked, Thomas talked to them constantly, telling them stories about his life, about Sarah and how much she had loved horses, about the farm in its better days when the barn had been full of life and purpose. The mare seemed to listen, her ears constantly swiveling to catch his words, and sometimes she would make low, gentle sounds in response as if she were participating in the conversation. The foals grew bolder, nibbling at his jacket and pulling at his pant legs with their soft mouths, playing games that made Thomas laugh out loud, a sound so rusty and unfamiliar that it startled him. That evening, as the sun began to set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at his 3 charges. They had transformed the space completely simply by their presence. The barn no longer felt empty or forgotten. It felt alive again, filled with purpose and warmth. Thomas realized that in saving these horses from the storm, he might have saved himself from something far worse, from the slow death of loneliness and despair that had been consuming him day by day since Sarah's passing. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm that Thomas had not experienced in years. He woke each morning with the sun, eager to get to the barn and check on his charges, and found himself whistling old tunes as he went about his chores. The mare, whom he had taken to calling grace for her elegant movements despite her massive size, had settled into the barn as if she had always lived there. The foals, whom he named Hope and Promise after much deliberation, grew bolder and more playful with each passing day, racing around the small paddock he had managed to repair and chasing each other with the pure joy that only young things possess. But as the days turned into a week, Thomas began to feel a growing unease. These horses had to belong to someone. Animals this magnificent did not simply appear out of nowhere, and surely their owner would be searching for them. He knew he should go into town and ask around, report their presence, and see if anyone had filed a missing horse report. Yet each time he considered making the trip, something held him back. It was not dishonesty exactly, more a reluctance to break the spell that had settled over his farm, a fear that once he opened his mouth and spoke of the horses to others, this brief moment of happiness would end and he would be left alone again. Still, his conscience would not let him rest. On the 8th day after the storm, Thomas hitched a ride into town with his neighbor Jacob, who passed by the farm each Tuesday morning on his way to the feed store. Jacob was a taciturn man who respected silence, which suited Thomas fine, but about halfway to town the neighbor glanced over at him and spoke. "You look different, Thomas. Got some color back in your face. Been eating better or something?" Thomas felt his cheeks warm with pleasure at the observation and mumbled something non-committal about the weather improving and spring coming on. He was not ready to share his secret yet, not until he knew more about what he was dealing with. The town of Millbrook was small, barely 300 souls, and everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. Thomas made his way to the sheriff's office, a single-room building next to the post office where Sheriff Tom Patterson sat behind a desk covered in papers and coffee cups. The sheriff looked up when Thomas entered, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Thomas Grayson, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you in town for what, 6 months? What brings you in today?" Thomas cleared his throat nervously and asked if anyone had reported missing horses, 3 white ones, a mare, and 2 foals. The sheriff leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "No, can't say anyone has." "That's pretty specific, though. You seen some horses like that?" Thomas hesitated, then decided to commit to the truth, or at least part of it. "Found them on my property after that big storm last week. Sheltered them in my barn. Thought someone might be looking for them." Sheriff Patterson's expression grew thoughtful, and he reached for a stack of papers on his desk, shuffling through them slowly. "Let me check the regional reports. Sometimes people file with the larger counties if they think horses might have wandered far." He spent several minutes reading through various documents while Thomas waited, hat in hand, feeling increasingly anxious. Finally, the sheriff looked up and shook his head again. Nothing in the system. No reports of stolen or missing horses matching that description within 200 miles. That's mighty strange. Thomas felt an odd mixture of relief and confusion wash over him. If no one was looking for the horses, did that mean he could keep them? Or did it mean something more troubling, that they had been deliberately abandoned or that their owner was unable to report them missing for some reason? The sheriff seemed to read his thoughts and leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. "Look, Thomas, I'll keep this on file and put out some inquiries to the surrounding counties. But if no one comes forward in 30 days, I'd say those horses are yours by right of salvage. You took them in, you've been caring for them. That counts for something. Just keep good records of your expenses in case an owner does show up wanting them back." Thomas thanked the sheriff and left the office feeling both lighter and heavier than when he had entered. He spent the rest of the morning walking through town, stopping at the general store for supplies he desperately needed and had been putting off buying. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Henderson, commented on how good he looked and asked if he was feeling all right. Word of his inquiry about the horses had apparently already spread, because she mentioned that she had heard he had taken in some strays. Small towns being what they were, Thomas thought ruefully, there were no secrets. He confirmed that yes, he had found some horses, and no, he did not know where they had come from, and left it at that. On the ride back to the farm with Jacob, Thomas stared out the window at the passing landscape and thought about what the next 30 days would bring. Part of him hoped desperately that no owner would appear, that Grace and hope and promise would remain with him permanently. Another part of him felt guilty for that hope, knowing that someone somewhere might be grieving for these animals, might be searching frantically for them even now. But the largest part of him simply wanted to get home, to see those 3 white shapes in his barn, to feel that sense of purpose and connection that had been missing from his life for so long. When he arrived back at the farm, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in warm golden light. Thomas walked quickly to the barn, his heart lifting as he heard the familiar sounds of the horses inside. Grace nickered softly when she saw him, a sound of greeting and recognition, and the foals came trotting over to investigate what he had brought, hoping for treats. Thomas pulled out the apple he had bought in town specifically for this moment and cut it into pieces, feeding them to each horse in turn and feeling their soft mouths against his palm. Whatever the next 30 days brought, he would cherish every moment of this unexpected gift. The days passed with surprising speed, each one blending into the next in a pattern of work and companionship that Thomas had not known since Sarah's death. He rose before dawn to tend to the horses, spending hours brushing their coats until they gleamed, checking their hooves, and ensuring they had fresh water and whatever feed he could afford or scrounge from his meager resources. His own meals became secondary, often just a piece of bread and some coffee, while he poured what little money he had into oats and hay for Grace and her foals. The horses were thriving under his care, their coats growing even more lustrous, the foals filling out and gaining strength with each passing day. But it was not just the physical care that occupied Thomas's time. He found himself talking to the horses constantly, sharing thoughts and memories he had kept locked away since Sarah's passing. He told Grace about his younger days, about the dreams he and Sarah had shared of building a prosperous farm, of raising children and grandchildren on this land. He spoke of his regrets and failures, of the slow decline that had taken everything from him piece by piece. Grace always listened with those intelligent brown eyes fixed on his face, and sometimes she would nudge him gently with her massive head, as if offering comfort. It was absurd to think a horse could understand human grief, Thomas knew, but it felt real nonetheless. On the 15th day, something extraordinary happened. Thomas had been cleaning out the stall, while Grace and the foals grazed in the paddock outside, and he was bent over scooping old hay when he heard an urgent whinny from Grace. He straightened immediately, his back protesting, and looked out to see the mare standing at attention, her body rigid and her ears pricked forward toward the road. Hope and promise huddled close to her sides, sensing their mother's alarm. Thomas followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. There was a truck coming up his long driveway, an expensive-looking vehicle that gleamed even under the dust it had accumulated on the dirt road. Thomas wiped his hands on his pants and walked slowly toward the house, his mind racing. The truck stopped near his porch and 2 men emerged, both dressed in clothes that marked them as city folk, or at least people with money. The first man was tall and heavyset, with a carefully groomed beard, wearing jeans that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month. The second was younger, lean and sharp-eyed, carrying a leather folder under his arm. They approached Thomas with the confident stride of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. The older man spoke first, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Thomas could not quite place. "Mr. Grayson, I presume. My name is Richard Ashford. I believe you may have found some horses that belong to me." Thomas felt his heart sink, but kept his expression neutral. He gestured toward the barn where Grace had now moved, positioning herself between the strangers and her foals, with clear protective intent. "Those the ones you mean?" Richard Ashford's eyes lit up when he saw the horses, and he started forward eagerly, but Grace pinned her ears back and stamped one massive hoof in warning. The man stopped immediately, his enthusiasm checked by the mare's obvious hostility. "That is definitely Aurora," Ashford said, his voice filled with satisfaction and something else, something that made Thomas uneasy. And her offspring. I have been searching for them for 3 weeks. They disappeared from my property during a transport. His companion opened the folder and produced several documents which he handed to Thomas. Breed registrations, ownership papers, all bearing the name Aurora's Grace, along with photographs that clearly showed the same mare, though taken in much different circumstances. In the photos, Grace, or Aurora as they called her, stood in an immaculate stable wearing a halter studded with what looked like jewels, her coat groomed to perfection. Thomas looked at the papers, his hands shaking slightly, knowing what they meant. These were legitimate documents, proof of ownership that would stand up in any court. His 30 days meant nothing against this kind of evidence. He looked up at Ashford and forced himself to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since the horses arrived. Why would horses like this be out in a storm? How did they get loose? Ashford's expression flickered with something uncomfortable, and he exchanged a glance with his companion before answering. There was an accident during transport. The trailer door came open and they bolted before we could stop them. We have been searching ever since. Something about the explanation did not sit right with Thomas, but he had no grounds to challenge it. These men had papers and proof, while he had only his growing attachment to 3 animals that had never really been his to keep. Yet as he looked past the men to where Grace stood watching them with clear distrust, he could not shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he was being told. Grace had not run from the storm like a frightened animal escaping captivity. She had run toward his barn with purpose, as if seeking sanctuary specifically, as if she knew exactly where she needed to go. "I will need to arrange transport," Ashford was saying, already pulling out his phone. "I can have a trailer here by tomorrow morning. Of course, I will compensate you for your trouble and the expenses you have incurred caring for them." He named a figure that was probably meant to be generous, but felt like an insult, like putting a price on the last 15 days of happiness Thomas had known. Thomas opened his mouth to refuse the money, but the practical part of his mind that had kept him alive through years of hardship reminded him that he needed every penny he could get. He nodded slowly, unable to find words. That evening, after Ashford and his companion had left with promises to return the next morning, Thomas sat on his porch and watched the sun sink below the horizon. The beauty of the sunset seemed to mock him, all those brilliant reds and oranges painting the sky while his heart felt heavy as stone in his chest. He had known from the beginning that the horses might not be his to keep, yet somehow he had allowed himself to hope, to dream of a future that included Grace and her foals. Now that dream was being ripped away, and the loss felt almost as sharp as when Sarah had passed. He could hear Grace moving around in the barn, restless and agitated. She had been that way ever since Ashford left, pacing her stall and whinnying at odd intervals. The foals, too, seemed disturbed, picking up on their mother's distress. Thomas rose from his seat and walked slowly to the barn, his old bones feeling every one of his 67 years. Inside, Grace stood at the door of her stall, her ears constantly moving as if listening for approaching danger. When she saw Thomas, she nickered softly and extended her head toward him. He reached up to stroke her neck, feeling the warmth of her skin and the strong pulse of life beneath. "I am so sorry, girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I do not want to let you go, but I do not have any choice. The papers are legal. You belong to him." Grace shook her head violently as if disagreeing with his words, and Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. It was foolish to think a horse could understand human speech, and yet her reaction seemed so pointed, so deliberate. She pushed her head against his chest hard enough to make him stagger back, and then she did something completely unexpected. She turned and walked to the back wall of the barn, the wall that separated the barn from Thomas's cabin, and she began to paw at it with one massive hoof. The sound was tremendous in the enclosed space, each strike of her hoof against the wood making a boom that echoed like thunder. Thomas hurried over to her, alarmed that she might hurt herself or damage the already deteriorating structure. But when he tried to lead her away, she resisted. She struck the wall again and again, her breath coming in heavy snorts, her whole body radiating a desperate urgency that Thomas could not comprehend. "Stop, Grace, please," he begged, pulling at her halter, but she was far too strong for him to control. Then suddenly she did stop, but only to turn and look at Thomas with eyes that held something he would later swear was a deliberate message. She walked back to her stall calmly, as if the outburst had never happened, and settled down with her foals. Thomas stood in the middle of the barn, breathing hard, his heart pounding from the exertion and confusion. What had that been about? He looked at the wall she had been striking and saw fresh gouges in the wood, deep marks from her hooves that had split several of the boards. Shaking his head in bewilderment, he extinguished the lantern and made his way back to his cabin, too tired and emotionally drained to think clearly about anything. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He lay in his narrow bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the night outside his window. Around 2 a.m, he heard Grace whinny again, a long, plaintive sound that seemed to carry more than just animal distress. He rose and pulled on his clothes, intending to check on her once more, but as he passed through his small living room on his way to the door, he froze in his tracks. Moonlight was streaming through the window, illuminating something on the wall that connected to the barn, and what Thomas saw made his blood run cold. There were words on the wall, not carved or written with pen, but somehow indented into the very wood itself, as if pressed there by tremendous force. The letters were rough and uneven, formed from the pattern of cracks and splits in the boards, but they were unmistakably intentional. Thomas fumbled for his flashlight with shaking hands and turned it on, the beam confirming what he had seen in the moonlight. The message read, "Beware. Danger. Not safe. Ashford lies. Help us." Thomas staggered backward and sat down hard on his old sofa, his mind reeling. This was impossible. Horses could not write. Horses could not communicate in human language. And yet the evidence was right there in front of him, pressed into the wood of his cabin wall from the barn side, created by the powerful hooves of a mare who had been desperately trying to tell him something he had been too blind to understand. His first instinct was to dismiss it as coincidence, as random damage that his tired mind was interpreting as words. But the more he stared at it, the more clearly the message stood out. Grace had been trying to warn him. That was why she had been so agitated when Ashford arrived. That was why she had attacked the wall with such desperate determination. Somehow, impossibly, she had known that Thomas needed to understand, and she had found a way to make him listen. He thought back to Ashford's story about the transport accident, about the trailer door coming open. Grace had not seemed like a horse that had escaped from confinement. She had seemed like a horse running toward something, toward safety, toward help. And now she was telling him in the only way she could that going back with Ashford meant danger. Thomas stood up and walked closer to the wall, running his fingers over the indented letters. They were deep and deliberate, impossible to dismiss as accident or imagination. His practical mind warred with what his eyes were showing him, but in the end, his heart won. He believed Grace. He did not know how she had done this or why she could do it, but he believed the message was real. And if it was real, then he had a decision to make. He could let Ashford take the horses tomorrow morning, sending Grace and her foals back to whatever dangers she was warning him about, or he could find some way to protect them, to keep them safe even though he had no legal right to do so. Thomas did not sleep for the rest of that night. He sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the message on the wall and wrestling with a decision that seemed impossible from every angle. The practical voice in his head, the one that had kept him alive through years of hardship and loss, told him he was being foolish. Horses could not write messages. The pattern in the wood was just coincidence, his desperate mind seeing what it wanted to see, because he did not want to lose the animals that had brought meaning back to his empty life. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, told him that he had seen what he had seen, that Grace had been trying to communicate with him, and that ignoring her warning would be a betrayal of the trust she had placed in him. As the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, Thomas made his decision. He would not simply hand over the horses to Ashford without understanding what danger Grace was warning him about. He owed her that much at least, even if it meant breaking the law or making powerful enemies. He stood up from the table, his body stiff from sitting in one position for so long, and went to the old desk in the corner where he kept his important papers. Buried beneath years of bills and notices, he found what he was looking for. The business card Sheriff Patterson had given him years ago when Sarah died, with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Thomas had never called that number. He had always been the type to handle his own problems, reluctant to burden others or admit that he needed help. But this was beyond his ability to handle alone. He picked up his ancient rotary phone and dialed the number carefully, his fingers fumbling with the dial. The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Sheriff Patterson, this is Thomas Grayson. I am sorry to call so early, but I need your help. It is about those horses I told you about." There was a pause, and Thomas could hear rustling as the sheriff presumably sat up in bed. The tone that came back was more alert, concerned. "What is wrong, Thomas? Did someone show up claiming them?" Thomas took a deep breath and told him everything. About Ashford's visit, about the papers that seemed legitimate, about how Grace had reacted to the man, and finally, though he knew how insane it would sound, about the message on the wall. He described it carefully, the letters formed from splits in the wood, the deliberate nature of the damage, the impossible warning that Grace had somehow created. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Thomas braced himself for disbelief or mockery. Instead, Sheriff Patterson surprised him. "Stay put, Thomas. Do not let anyone take those horses until I get there. I will be at your place in 20 minutes. True to his word, the sheriff's patrol car pulled up to Thomas's cabin just as the sun was fully clearing the horizon. Tom Patterson emerged with 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town and handed one to Thomas, who accepted it gratefully. The sheriff followed Thomas inside and stood in front of the wall for a long time, not speaking, just studying the pattern of damage. Finally, he pulled out his phone and took several photographs from different angles. "Thomas, I do not know what to make of this," he said slowly, his voice carefully neutral. "Part of me says it is just cracks in old wood. But another part, the part that has seen a lot of strange things in 30 years of law enforcement, says that the pattern is too deliberate to be random." Thomas felt a surge of relief that the sheriff was at least taking him seriously. "What do we do?" "Ashford has legal papers. He has every right to take the horses." Sheriff Patterson nodded thoughtfully and pulled out his own phone. "Let me make some calls. Something about this whole situation does not sit right with me. If those papers are legitimate, they should show up in the National Registry. And if there was a transport accident like Ashford claimed, there should be a police report filed somewhere. Give me an hour before he arrives." The sheriff went back to his car to make his calls, while Thomas returned to the barn to check on Grace and the foals. The mare was calm now, watching him with those knowing eyes as he entered. Thomas walked up to her and rested his forehead against her neck. "I am trying, girl," he whispered. "I do not know if I can stop him, but I am trying." Grace made a low sound deep in her chest, not quite a nicker, more like a rumble of acknowledgement. The foals, sensing the tension, stayed close to their mother, their heads tucked under her protective stance. An hour later, Sheriff Patterson returned to the cabin, his expression grim. "Thomas, there is something very wrong here. I called the National Horse Registry and several transport companies. There is no record of an Aurora's Grace registered to a Richard Ashford. The papers he showed you might look official, but they are not in the system. More importantly, I called colleagues in the surrounding states. 3 weeks ago, a wealthy horse breeder named Marcus Ashford, Richard's brother, died under suspicious circumstances. Marcus had a valuable mare that disappeared from his estate the same night. The estate is in probate, and Richard has been fighting other family members over the inheritance, including the horses. Thomas felt his stomach clench. So you are saying Grace might have been stolen? That Richard is trying to claim her as his own? The sheriff nodded slowly. I am saying that at the very least, ownership is disputed. At worst, Richard Ashford might have been involved in his brother's death and the theft of valuable animals. Until we sort this out, those horses are not going anywhere. I will be here when he arrives, and I will inform him that the horses are being held as evidence in an ongoing investigation. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a truck engine growled up the driveway. Thomas and the sheriff walked outside to see Ashford's vehicle approaching, this time pulling a large horse trailer behind it. The man emerged from the truck with a confident smile that faltered when he saw the sheriff's patrol car parked next to Thomas's cabin. Mr. Ashford, Sheriff Patterson said, stepping forward with his hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon. I'm going to need you to answer some questions before you take any animals from this property. Ashford's expression shifted from confusion to anger in an instant. I have already shown Mr. Grayson all the necessary documentation. Those horses are legally mine. The sheriff pulled out his phone and showed Ashford the photographs he had taken earlier. Then you will not mind explaining why there is no record of your ownership in the National Registry. And while you are at it, perhaps you can tell me about your brother Marcus and what happened the night he died. The color drained from Ashford's face, and Thomas saw fear flash in his eyes before the man controlled his expression. I do not know what you are implying, Sheriff, but I suggest you be very careful about making accusations without evidence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Sheriff Patterson and Richard Ashford faced each other in Thomas's driveway. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dirt and dried grass, while from the barn came the sound of Grace moving restlessly, as if she could sense the confrontation taking place outside. Thomas stood to the side, his heart pounding in his chest, watching the two men size each other up like predators circling before a fight. He had lived his whole life avoiding conflict, keeping his head down and minding his own business, but now he found himself at the center of something that felt much larger and more dangerous than anything he had experienced before. Ashford's companion, the lean young man who had accompanied him the previous day, emerged from the passenger side of the truck and moved to stand beside his employer. There was something about his posture, the way his hand moved to his jacket, that made Sheriff Patterson tense visibly. Thomas realized with a cold shock that the man might be armed, that this situation could turn violent in an instant. The sheriff must have had the same thought because his hand moved closer to his own weapon, though he kept his voice calm and professional. I am going to need both of you to keep your hands where I can see them. This does not have to get complicated. We are just going to have a conversation about ownership and documentation, and then we will sort everything out properly. Ashford laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You have no authority to hold my property, Sheriff. This is harassment. I will have your badge for this. Sheriff Patterson did not rise to the bait. He had dealt with plenty of men like Ashford over the years, men who thought money and threats could make problems disappear. Perhaps, he said evenly, but until we verify your ownership claims through proper channels, those horses remain here. I have already contacted state police and federal authorities about the circumstances surrounding your brother's death and the missing animals. They are very interested in speaking with you. The color that had drained from Ashford's face earlier returned in a flush of anger. Marcus's death was an accident. The investigation was closed. And even if it were not, that has nothing to do with my ownership of those horses. He gestured sharply toward the barn. Aurora belonged to my brother, which means she now belongs to me as next of kin. The foals were bred on family property. Show me one shred of evidence that says otherwise. Thomas felt his courage rising despite his fear. The way Grace reacted to you yesterday was not the reaction of a horse to her owner. She was afraid of you. And the papers you showed me, they look official, but the sheriff says they are not registered anywhere. Why is that? Ashford turned his cold gaze on Thomas, and the old farmer felt the full weight of the man's contempt. You are a foolish old man living in a falling-down shack, playing farmer with animals you could never afford in 1,000 lifetimes. Do you really think your opinion matters here? Do you think anyone cares what you believe about my horses? Those words, meant to wound and diminish, had the opposite effect. Something hardened in Thomas's chest, a core of steel he had forgotten he possessed. These might be your family's horses by blood, but that mare chose to come to my property. She sought shelter here. And if she is afraid of you, then maybe there is a good reason for that. The young companion stepped forward menacingly, but Sheriff Patterson moved to block his path. That is far enough. Everyone needs to calm down right now. Ashford, I am giving you a choice. You can leave peacefully and wait for the investigation to conclude, or I can arrest you for trespassing and threatening behavior. Either way, those horses are not leaving this property today. Ashford's jaw clenched, and for a moment Thomas thought he might actually attack the sheriff, but then he visibly controlled himself. This is not over, he said in a low, dangerous voice. Not by a long shot. I have lawyers who will bury both of you. That mare is worth more than this entire worthless farm 10 times over, and I will have what belongs to me. With that, Ashford turned and strode back to his truck, his companion following after casting one last threatening look at Thomas and the sheriff. The truck's engine roared to life, and Ashford reversed violently down the driveway, the horse trailer fishtailing slightly before he regained control and sped away in a cloud of dust. Thomas let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and felt his legs go weak with relief. Sheriff Patterson holstered his weapon and turned to look at him with concern. You okay, Thomas? That was intense. I was worried things were going to go bad there for a minute. Thomas nodded shakily. What happens now? The sheriff rubbed his face tiredly. Now I make a lot more phone calls. I need to contact Marcus Ashford's estate executor, verify the circumstances of his death, and get a court order to officially hold those horses as disputed property. It is going to take time, maybe weeks, or even months, depending on how complicated the estate situation is. In the meantime, the horses stay with you if you are willing to continue caring for them. I will need you to document everything, keep receipts for all expenses, and not let anyone onto your property without calling me first. Ashford was serious about those lawyers. This is going to get ugly. Thomas looked toward the barn where Grace stood visible in the doorway, her white coat brilliant in the morning sunlight. She was watching the departing truck with alert attention, her ears forward, and even from this distance Thomas could sense her relief that the danger had passed. I will do whatever it takes, he said quietly. Grace trusted me to protect her and her foals. I will not let her down. The sheriff smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. I believe you, Thomas, and for what it is worth, I believe there is something special about that mare. I do not know if she can really communicate the way you think, but I saw her reaction to Ashford yesterday through your description, and I saw fear. Animals know things we do not. They sense evil that we rationalize away. After the sheriff left with promises to return later that day with official paperwork, Thomas walked slowly to the barn. Grace met him at the door, and this time she lowered her great head to his shoulder in a gesture that felt unmistakably like gratitude. He wrapped his arms around her neck as far as they would reach and felt her warmth, her living strength, the steady beating of her heart. "We are not out of danger yet, girl," he murmured. "But I promise you, as long as I am breathing, no one is taking you or your babies anywhere you do not want to go." Grace made that deep rumbling sound again, and Thomas chose to believe it was her way of saying she understood, that she trusted him, that somehow, against all logic and reason, an old broken-down farmer and a mystical white mare had formed a bond that would withstand whatever storm was coming. The weeks that followed were the most stressful Thomas had experienced since Sarah's illness and death. True to his word, Ashford had unleashed a team of expensive lawyers who filed motion after motion, demanding the immediate return of the horses. Sheriff Patterson spent hours at Thomas's farm, documenting everything, taking photographs and statements, building a case that would hold up in court. The investigation into Marcus Ashford's death had been reopened based on new evidence, though the sheriff could not share many details. What he did tell Thomas was that Marcus had been a kind man who had devoted his life to breeding and rescuing rare horse bloodlines, and that several people close to him suspected Richard of foul play motivated by greed. Thomas found himself becoming something of a local celebrity, though not in any way he would have chosen. Word spread through Millbrook and the surrounding areas about the poor farmer protecting the mysterious white horses from a potentially dangerous criminal. Reporters from regional newspapers came to interview him, and he found their attention embarrassing and intrusive. He was not a hero, he insisted. He was just a man trying to do right by animals that had sought shelter on his property. But the story captured people's imagination, perhaps because in these modern times there was something appealing about the image of a simple farmer standing up to wealth and power, or perhaps because Grace herself was such a magnificent and mysterious creature that people wanted to believe in something magical. The community rallied around Thomas in ways that brought tears to his eyes. Neighbors he barely knew started appearing at his farm with donations of hay and grain, refusing to accept payment. Mrs. Henderson from the general store brought groceries every week, waving away his protests about charity. Even the local veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, offered her services free of charge to ensure Grace and the foals remained healthy. She examined all 3 horses thoroughly and told Thomas that she had never seen animals in such perfect condition, especially considering their mysterious origins. "There is something remarkable about this mare," she said, running her hands over Grace's powerful shoulders and legs. "Her bone structure is extraordinary. She has characteristics of draft horses, warm bloods, and even some ancient breeds that are nearly extinct. If Marcus Ashford was breeding horses like her, he was doing something truly special." One evening, about 3 weeks after Ashford's confrontation with the sheriff, Thomas was in the barn grooming Grace when she suddenly became agitated again. Her ears pinned back and she began moving restlessly in her stall, whinnying with obvious distress. The foals picked up on their mother's fear immediately, pressing against her sides and making their own frightened sounds. Thomas tried to calm Grace, speaking in soothing tones, but she would not settle. She pawed at the ground and tossed her head, her eyes rolling to show the whites. Then Thomas heard what had alarmed her. The sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines coming up his driveway fast. His first thought was that Ashford had returned with reinforcements, perhaps planning to take the horses by force, and fear shot through him like ice water. But when he hurried to the barn door to look out, he saw Sheriff Patterson's patrol car leading a convoy of 3 other vehicles, their lights flashing in the gathering dusk. The sheriff emerged quickly and jogged over to Thomas, his expression grave but also carrying a hint of satisfaction. "Thomas, we got him." Richard Ashford was arrested 2 hours ago on charges of fraud, grand theft, and second-degree murder. The state police found evidence that he poisoned his brother and then tried to steal the estate's most valuable assets, including that mare you are protecting. Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief and had to lean against the barn door for support. So Grace really did belong to Marcus? She was not stolen? The sheriff shook his head. She belonged to Marcus, and according to his will, all his horses were to go to a foundation he had established for the preservation of rare breeds. The foundation has been trying to locate her since Marcus's death. When they heard about our situation here, they contacted me immediately. Some of the other people climbing out of the vehicles were approaching now, including a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the Ashford Equine Heritage Foundation, and explained that she had worked closely with Marcus for years before his death. She looked at Grace with wonder and emotion clear on her face. "That is Aurora's Grace," she said softly. "Marcus's pride and joy. She is one of a kind, Thomas. Her bloodline goes back centuries, to horses that were thought to be lost forever. Marcus spent his fortune tracking down and breeding horses with ancient bloodlines, trying to preserve genetic diversity that modern breeding has nearly eliminated. Aurora represents his life's work. The foals, too, are incredibly valuable, not in monetary terms, but in terms of what they mean for preserving these rare genetic lines." Thomas listened to all of this with growing understanding and a sinking feeling in his chest. He had known Grace was special, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms made him realize how impossible it would be for him to keep her. A horse of her importance belonged in the hands of experts who could continue Marcus's work, not on a failing farm with an old man who could barely afford to feed himself. Dr. Morrison seemed to read his thoughts and his distress. She stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Thomas, I know you have formed a bond with Aurora. Sheriff Patterson told me about your dedication to her and her foals, about how you took them in during that terrible storm and have protected them ever since. Marcus would have been grateful beyond words. The Foundation wants to honor that. We are not here to simply take the horses away. We want to make you an offer." Thomas looked at her with confusion and a faint stirring of hope he was afraid to acknowledge. "What kind of offer?" Dr. Morrison smiled. "The Foundation needs a caretaker for Aurora and several other horses we maintain. Someone who can give them individual attention and love, not just professional care. The position comes with a salary, a house on the Foundation property, and full support for all the horses' needs. But more than that, it would allow you to stay with Aurora, to continue the bond you have built with her. We have seen how she trusts you, how she responds to you. That kind of connection is rare and precious. Marcus believed that horses choose their people as much as people choose horses. Aurora chose you, Thomas. We would like to honor that choice if you are willing." Thomas stared at her, unable to speak, certain he had misunderstood or that this was some kind of dream. "You want to give me a job? To stay with Grace?" Dr. Morrison nodded. "Marcus left instructions in his will that if anything happened to him, we should find good homes for his horses with people who would love them. Not just stable them, but truly care for them as individuals. You have already proven yourself to be exactly the kind of person Marcus hoped we would find. So yes, we want you to come work for the Foundation, to be Aurora's primary caretaker and to help us with the other horses in the preservation program. It would mean leaving this farm, starting a new chapter of your life, but you would be doing something important, something that would honor Marcus's legacy and your own love for these animals." Thomas looked from Dr. Morrison to Grace, then back again, his mind struggling to process what he was being offered. It seemed too good to be true, too perfect a solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable just moments before. All his life he had learned to be suspicious of offers that appeared too generous, to expect the catch that would snatch away hope at the last moment. But when he looked into Dr. Morrison's eyes, he saw only sincerity and kindness, the same qualities he had valued in Sarah and had thought were rare in this world. And when he looked at Grace, the mare was watching him with that knowing gaze, her ears forward, as if she too was waiting for his answer and hoping he would say yes. "I do not know what to say," Thomas managed finally, his voice thick with emotion. "This farm has been my whole life. My wife and I built everything here together, even though it all fell apart after she passed. I am not sure I know how to start over at my age." Dr. Morrison smiled gently and gestured around at the dilapidated barn, the sagging fences, the worn cabin. "Sometimes starting over is not about abandoning the past, Thomas. It is about honoring it by finding new purpose. Your wife would want you to be happy, to have a reason to wake up each morning. And Marcus, if he were here, would want his life's work to continue in the hands of someone who truly loves these animals. You would not be starting from nothing. You would be building on everything you have learned, everything you have been, and adding to it in ways you never imagined possible." Sheriff Patterson stepped forward and added his own perspective. "Thomas, in all the years I have known you, I have never seen you as alive as you have been these past weeks. Grace gave you something back that you had lost. This offer means you do not have to lose it again." The sheriff was right, Thomas realized. These weeks caring for Grace and her foals had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death. He had felt useful again, needed, connected to something larger than his own grief and decline. The thought of returning to the empty silence of his days before the storm filled him with a dread he could not name, and the thought of being separated from Grace now felt like losing another piece of his heart that he could not afford to lose. He took a deep breath and looked at Dr. Morrison with decision firming in his chest. "I accept. I would be honored to work for the Foundation and to continue caring for Grace and her foals." The words came out stronger than he expected, and as soon as he spoke them, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. Dr. Morrison's face lit up with genuine joy, and she reached out to shake his hand. "Welcome to the Foundation, Thomas. Marcus would be so pleased. And so am I. We will help you with everything. The move, settling into your new home, all of it. You will not be alone in this transition." That night, after the Foundation people had left with plans to return in a few days to begin the moving process, Thomas sat in his cabin one last time looking at the message on the wall. The words were still there, pressed impossibly into the wood by Grace's powerful hooves, a warning that had saved her life and changed his own forever. He reached out and traced the letters with his fingers, feeling the depth of the impressions, the deliberate force that had created them. He still did not understand how it was possible, how a horse could communicate with such clarity and purpose. But he no longer questioned that it had happened. Some things in life were beyond explanation, beyond the limits of what science and reason could account for. Grace was one of those things, a mystery wrapped in white hide and knowing brown eyes. The next morning, Thomas stood on his porch for the last time and looked out over the land that had been his prison and his refuge for so many years. The rising sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in a very long time, the view did not fill him with sadness or regret. Instead, he felt gratitude for what this place had given him, for the life he had shared here with Sarah, for the lessons learned in hardship and loss, and most of all, for being here when Grace needed sanctuary. This old farm had one last gift to give him, one final purpose to serve, and it had fulfilled that purpose beyond anything he could have imagined. Grace and her foals were loaded carefully into the Foundation's professional horse trailer, a far cry from whatever vehicle Ashford had used in his attempt to steal them. The mare walked up the ramp calmly, trusting Thomas, who stood at the front, holding a lead rope, though both of them knew she did not really need to be led. The foals followed their mother without fear, already growing into the magnificent animals they would become under the Foundation's care. As Thomas secured them for the journey, Grace turned her head and looked at him with those impossibly wise eyes, and he could have sworn he saw understanding there, and approval, and something that looked remarkably like love. The drive to the foundation took 3 hours through Montana countryside that Thomas had rarely seen, despite living in the state his entire life. When they finally arrived, he was struck by the beauty of the property. Rolling green pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with horses of various colors and breeds, all of them clearly thriving under expert care. The barns were immaculate but warm, designed with the animals' comfort in mind rather than human vanity. And the small house that would be his new home sat on a gentle rise overlooking it all, with a porch that reminded him just enough of his old cabin to feel familiar without making him sad. As Grace was released into her new pasture, her foals racing beside her with unbridled joy at the open space, Thomas stood at the fence and watched them run. Dr. Morrison came to stand beside him, smiling at the sight. "She belongs here," she said softly. "They all do. And so do you, Thomas. Welcome home." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and as Grace galloped past with her mane flying like a silver banner in the wind, he knew that somehow, impossibly, an old farmer and a magical mare had both found their way to exactly where they needed to be. The message on the cabin wall had warned of danger and called for help, and in answering that call, Thomas had discovered that sometimes the ones we save end up saving us in return.